What if Noah's flood was never just about rain, animals, and an ark? What if, behind the rising waters, Noah witnessed a judgment far more terrifying than the world was ever told? In 1947, near the Dead Sea, a Bedouin shepherd discovered ancient scrolls hidden inside desert caves. These writings, preserved for more than 2,000 years, pointed to a darker mystery surrounding the flood. Genesis says the earth was filled with violence, and that Noah was righteous in his generation. But before the flood, Scripture also speaks of the sons of God, the daughters of men, and the Nephilim who lived on the earth in those days. Why were these beings mentioned so briefly? Why did judgment come immediately after their appearance? If this mystery already feels deeper than the flood story you were taught, subscribe to the channel and like this video now. Because what Noah witnessed next changes the entire meaning of the ancient world. Ancient traditions claim Noah was not only a survivor, he was a witness. As the fountains of the deep burst open and the heavens poured down judgment, Noah saw the old world being erased. Not only because of human wickedness, but because the story suggests that creation itself had fallen into deep corruption. And if that is true, then the real question is this: what did Noah see when the waters covered the earth? Before we can understand what Noah saw when the waters rose, we must first look at the world those waters were sent to judge. This was not a quiet ancient world of simple tents, fields, and harmless villages. It was a world moving toward collapse. Something had entered human history that was never meant to belong there. The boundary between heaven and earth had been crossed, and once that line was broken, creation itself began to change. Genesis gives only a brief glimpse of this mystery. It says, "The sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose." Then the text adds, "There were giants in the earth in those days." Those few words open a terrifying door. Ancient traditions describe powerful heavenly beings who abandoned their proper place and came down among mankind. They did not simply observe humanity, they influenced it. They taught knowledge that should never have been placed in human hands so early. Arts of power, war, hidden rituals, and secrets that pulled mankind away from God. And from this forbidden crossing came the Nephilim, beings remembered as giants, mighty ones, figures of fear and legend. Their presence did not make the world stronger, it made the world unstable. Violence spread, corruption deepened. Human wickedness was no longer ordinary rebellion. It had become entangled with something darker and older. That is why Genesis says, "God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually." From this point of view, the flood was not presented as a random disaster. It was judgment against a world that had reached the edge of ruin. Humanity had fallen, but the corruption had gone beyond humanity. Something from the heavenly realm had poisoned the earth. And Noah was about to witness the moment God answered it. Before we enter those 40 days of judgment, subscribe to the channel and like this video. The 5, because the next part reveals why Noah was not only saved from the flood, he was chosen to witness something generations had forgotten. Noah was not standing at the edge of history as an ordinary man waiting for rain. He was standing at the center of a judgment that reached far beyond the earth. While the world around him ignored every warning, Noah obeyed. Scripture says Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations. 5, and Noah walked with God. That single sentence separates him from an entire age collapsing under corruption. He was not building the ark because he understood every mystery. He was building because God had spoken. But the ark was more than wood sealed against water. It was a vessel of preservation. Inside it, God protected a family, a future, and 5 and a testimony that the old world would not survive to tell. The flood was coming against something deeper than ordinary human evil. Genesis says, "The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence." That corruption had spread so far that judgment could no longer be delayed. Ancient traditions claim the heavens themselves had been disturbed. The order between the visible and invisible realms had been broken. The Watchers, 5 remembered in forbidden writings, had crossed into the human world and changed the course of mankind. And 5 names such as Shemihaza and Azazel became connected with rebellion, forbidden knowledge, and the rise of the Nephilim. If this tradition is true, then Noah was chosen for more than survival. He was chosen to witness the answer of God. When the heavens opened and the deep broke apart, Noah was carried above a world being judged below him. The ark rose over the waters, but beneath those waters, an ancient corruption was being confronted. What looked like a flood from the outside was, in truth, a cleansing of creation itself. And Noah, the 5 sealed inside the ark, became the living witness of that moment, the man who survived not only the end of a world, but the opening scene of a cosmic judgment. Then came the moment that changed everything Noah had ever known. The sky did not simply darken. The order of the world broke open. Scripture says, "All the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened." The flood was not a soft rain falling over quiet hills. It was the collapse of an age. Waters rose from below. Judgment poured from above. The earth itself seemed to tremble under the weight of God's decree for 40 days and 40 nights. 5. The old world disappeared beneath the flood. Inside the ark, Noah was carried above the destruction. But according to ancient traditions, he saw more than cities vanishing and mountains swallowed by water. He saw the hidden powers behind that corruption being judged. The Watchers, once clothed in heavenly authority, were no longer standing as rulers over mankind. Their rebellion had reached its limit. The same beings who had crossed the forbidden boundary were now being brought under divine sentence. Their glory was stripped away. Their power was broken. The flood that covered the earth also exposed the unseen war behind human history and the Nephilim. The mighty ones remembered in ancient fear could not escape the judgment. Their bodies belonged to the doomed world, and that world was being buried beneath the waters. But the mystery did not end there. Ancient writings claim that something remained after their physical forms were destroyed. Restless spirits, cut off from the bodies they once possessed, wandering through the earth as a dark reminder of the corruption before the flood. This is why the flood was more than destruction. It was separation. It was cleansing. It was the moment God drew a line between the world He created and the corruption that had invaded it. Noah witnessed the end of an age. But he also witnessed something greater, the defeat of powers that mankind had feared for generations. And as the ark rose higher over the waters, the old world sank deeper into judgment. When the waters began to fall, the world Noah saw was not the world he had left behind. The ark came to rest, and silence spread over the earth like a veil. The voices of the old age were gone. Its cities, its violence, its corrupted powers, its giants of terror, all of it had vanished beneath the waters. Noah stepped out into a cleansed world, but he did not step out as a man who had simply survived a storm. He stepped out carrying a memory no flood could wash away. Scripture says, "And Noah builded an altar unto the Lord." Then God made a covenant with Noah and his sons, and promising that the waters would never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. The rainbow appeared as a sign in the clouds, a visible promise over a wounded earth. But beneath that promise, Noah carried a heavier memory. Noah had seen judgment from inside the ark. He had watched the old world end, And according to ancient traditions, he understood that the flood had not only cleansed human violence, it had answered a deeper corruption that had entered creation before the rain began. So the story did not end when the ground dried. It continued in the memory of Noah's household. His sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, did not inherit only the task of filling the earth again. They inherited the burden of remembering what had truly happened. As generations passed, that memory traveled outward. It changed languages. It entered legends. It appeared in distant flood stories, in tales of mighty beings cast down, in myths of a former world destroyed by divine judgment. The details shifted, but the shadow of the same event remained. Over time, the sharper edges of the story were softened. The Watchers became vague figures. The Nephilim became distant giants of legend. The cosmic judgment behind the flood was reduced to a simpler tale that was easier to teach, easier to control, and easier to forget. 5. But memory has a way of surviving. Fragments remained in ancient writings, guarded traditions, and hidden communities. The official story became shorter, but the deeper testimony did not disappear. Somewhere beneath the familiar account of Noah, the Ark, the 5, and the rainbow, another memory kept breathing. And that memory points to a question that refuses to die. What was removed from the story before it reached us? Now return to Genesis 6 through 9, but read it as if every sentence is holding back something larger. The familiar story is there, the corruption of the earth, the grief of God, the righteousness of Noah, the command to build the ark, the flood, the 5, the covenant, and the rainbow. But before the flood begins, Genesis places one strange detail directly in front of us. It says, "The sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose." Then it adds, "There were giants in the earth in those days." The passage moves quickly, almost too quickly. It names the mystery, then passes over it. Who were these sons of God? Why are the Nephilim mentioned at the very doorway of judgment? And why does the text not explain what happened to them when the waters came? These are not small questions. They sit at the center of the flood story like buried stones under shallow soil. Genesis says, "The earth also was corrupt before God." E5, and the earth was filled with violence. It also says, "Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord." Between those two truths stands a hidden crisis, a world so corrupted that God chose to preserve life. A5, through one family and one ark. Later traditions did not ignore this mystery. Early Jewish and Christian writings spoke more openly about rebellious heavenly beings, forbidden knowledge, and a judgment that reached beyond mankind. But as centuries passed, many of those explanations were pushed aside. The 5 and the shorter version became the one most people knew, yet the traces remain. Genesis does not erase the sons of God. It does not erase the Nephilim. It does not erase the timing of their appearance before the flood. The text leaves enough behind to make the reader ask what happened before the rain began. And once you see those traces, I5, the flood, no longer feels like a simple disaster story. It becomes the visible surface of a much deeper judgment, one that the ancient world remembered, but later generations struggled to explain. The 5, this is where the Book of Enoch becomes important to the mystery. It is not part of most modern Bibles, yet its shadow falls across the New Testament. 5 Jude refers to Enoch when he writes, "Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints." That single quotation shows that early believers knew traditions connected to Enoch. The man Genesis describes with the words, "Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him." According to these ancient writings, Enoch was shown mysteries hidden from ordinary men. He saw the rebellion of the Watchers, learned their names, and recorded the knowledge they gave to humanity. These beings did not merely fall in silence. They taught mankind paths that led to corruption, violence, and spiritual confusion. The Book of Enoch presents their judgment as unavoidable. The Watchers seek mercy. 5. But the sentence has already been set. Their rebellion has crossed a line that cannot be undone. And in this tradition, the flood becomes more than a judgment against human wickedness. Our 5, it becomes the moment when heaven answers the corruption that had spread through the earth. This changes the role of Noah. He was not simply the man who entered the ark. He became the witness who carried the memory of what God had done. While Genesis gives the shorter account, Enoch and other ancient writings expand the hidden background, rebellious powers, corrupted knowledge. 5. The Nephilim, and a judgment that touched both earth and the unseen realm. Together, these texts do not replace Genesis. They press against its edges. They ask why Genesis mentions the sons of God and the Nephilim, then moves forward so quickly. And if these traditions preserve even a fragment of the older memory, then Noah's flood was not only the end of a violent generation. It was the public defeat of powers that had tried to reshape creation itself. But if these writings carried such a powerful memory, how did they survive at all? They survived because not every community allowed the older traditions to disappear. Some copied them, some guarded them. Some carried them across deserts, monasteries, and generations. Even when the wider religious world moved in another direction, near Qumran. 5. A community preserved ancient writings with extraordinary care. Among the texts connected to the Dead Sea Scrolls were fragments of Enochic tradition. 5. Showing that these ideas were known long before later debates about the biblical canon. This matters because it places the story of the Watchers, the Nephilim, and divine judgment inside the world of ancient Judaism, not as a late invention, but as part of a much older conversation. And the memory did not survive in only one place. In Ethiopia, the Orthodox Tewahedo tradition preserved the Book of Enoch as scripture, keeping alive a text that most other traditions left outside their Bibles. While many readers in the West forgot Enoch almost completely, Ethiopian Christianity continued to read it, copy it, and treat it as part of sacred history. Then came the discoveries of the 20th century. In 1947, scrolls hidden near the Dead Sea brought ancient Jewish writings back into the light. Suddenly, the world could see that some of these traditions had roots reaching back centuries before Christ. The story could no longer be dismissed as something created much later. It belonged to the religious atmosphere that shaped the world of Jesus and the apostles. And there is another striking clue. Jude writes, "Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints," echoing the Enochic tradition directly. That means the early Christian world was not unfamiliar with these ideas. They were part of the language, imagination, and warning system of the time. Other ancient texts, including writings discovered near Nag Hammadi, also speak in different ways about hidden powers, corrupted realms, and spiritual conflict. They do not all tell the story the same way, but they show that the ancient world was deeply concerned with unseen forces behind visible history. Scholars have spent generations studying these fragments, comparing manuscripts, traditions, and ancient beliefs. Piece by piece, 5. A wider picture begins to appear. The flood was remembered not only as water covering the earth, but as a turning point in a larger spiritual conflict. And if that memory survived in caves, churches, fragments, and forgotten books, then the question becomes even sharper. Why was this part of the story pushed so far into the shadows? At this point, the meaning of the flood becomes far larger than a disaster story. If the ancient traditions are read beside Genesis, the flood was not only about water covering the earth. It was about God confronting a corruption that had reached into the visible and invisible world at the same time. Human violence filled the land, but behind that violence stood a deeper spiritual disorder. Genesis says, "The earth was filled with violence." It also says, "All flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth." These words describe more than moral failure. They describe a world where the order of creation itself had been damaged. That is why Noah's survival matters so deeply. He was not preserved by accident. He became the living bridge between the world before judgment and the world after it. Through him, God protected the human line, the covenant promise, and the future hope that would one day lead to redemption. This connects back to the first promise in Genesis, where God speaks of the conflict between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. That struggle did not disappear. It moved through history, through bloodlines, kingdoms, temptations, and unseen powers. The flood becomes one of the great moments where God intervenes to stop corruption from swallowing the future completely. And this is why later scripture speaks so strongly about invisible conflict. Paul writes that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers. Suddenly, those words feel connected to something ancient. The battle was never only political, never only human, never only earthly. Across the world, many cultures remembered a great flood. Different names, different languages, different symbols, but again and again the same shadow appears. An old world destroyed, divine judgment, mighty beings brought low. And five, and a new beginning rising from the waters, ancient monuments, flood legends, mountain traditions, and stories of giants all point toward a memory humanity could never fully erase. Some details became myth, some became symbol. Some were reshaped by culture. But the central echo remained. The earth had once been judged. And if Noah saw that judgment with his own eyes, then the flood was not the end of the story. It was the moment the hidden war became visible, the moment creation was cleansed, and the moment God declared that darkness would not be allowed to rule forever. So why did this part of the story fade from view? As the centuries passed, religious communities had to decide which writings would be read publicly, taught widely, and treated as authoritative. Some texts remained at the center, others moved to the edges. The Book of Enoch, once known in ancient Jewish and early Christian circles, was eventually left outside most biblical canons, even though echoes of its world still remained. For many leaders, the story was difficult. It spoke of heavenly rebellion, forbidden knowledge, giants, judgment, and powers beyond human sight. It made the flood larger, darker, and more complex than a simple lesson about human wickedness. It forced readers to ask whether evil entered history through more than human choice alone. And that question was dangerous to simple explanations. Over time, the flood was often retold in a safer form. Noah, the ark, the animals, the rain, the rainbow, all true elements, but not the whole weight of the ancient memory. The deeper conflict was pushed into forgotten books, scattered traditions, and fragments preserved far from the main road of history, yet the clues never vanished. Genesis still speaks of the sons of God. It still names the Nephilim. Jude still preserves the words, "Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints." Peter still writes of angels who sinned and were delivered into chains of darkness. These are not empty echoes. They are doors left slightly open. Through those remaining clues, the older picture begins to return. Noah saw more than rising water. He saw judgment moving through creation. He saw the end of a corrupted age. He saw that the powers behind the violence of the old world were not beyond the reach of God. The flood was not chaos without meaning. It was a boundary. It was a cleansing. It was the moment heaven declared that corruption could spread, but it could not reign forever. And that is the hidden force of Noah's testimony. He came out of the ark into a world washed clean and carrying the memory of what had been judged beneath the waters. The rainbow did not erase that memory. It stood above it. A sign that mercy would follow judgment, and that the future of humanity had not been abandoned. So the real secret of Noah is not only what he survived, it is what he witnessed. If this story made you Noah's flood in a completely different way, subscribe to the channel and like this video, because the next mystery will go even deeper into the ancient secrets preserved inside scripture and forgotten traditions.